With that said, back to the question. Should you still do hammer curls? So my arms are admittedly one of the strongest parts of my physique. However, believe it or not, at one point in time, it was actually one of the weaker parts of my physique. Like any other muscle group, I slowly focused on bringing my arms up over time. And in this video, I want to show you exactly if I were to do a full arm workout, what that would actually look like. I'm gonna answer the truth about biasing the long head over the short head, the triceps, biceps, and answer the current pressing questions whether you should be doing hammer curls or not. Did hammer curls get vaulted, as some people are saying? Well, let me get right into that. All right, so we're gonna be starting this workout with a triceps exercise. And the reason being is if you're concerned with overall arm size, the triceps make up most of the upper arm and thus will be the biggest bang for a buck to focus on. And with that said, the triceps has three heads: the long head, short head, as well as the medial head. Now, there is some controversy over how to actually bias the long head. On one hand, you have the exercise scientist camp that says in order to bias the long head, you need to do an overhead tricep extension because since the long head crosses both the elbow as well as the shoulder joint, putting the arm overhead like this stretches the long head, and that's because of like stretch-mediated hypertrophy and all this evidence showing that training in the length position is probably a good thing for hypertrophy. We're able to bias the long head by giving it a stretch. However, on the other side, we have the biomechanics camp that says actually the opposite. In order to bias the long head, you need the arm by the side of your body. And the rationale is when you do an overhead tricep extension, although you are stretching the long head at the shoulder joint, this actually puts it in an anatomically inferior position to have as good force output at the elbow joint. In other words, because we're stretching it at the shoulder joint, the longer head is going to have a harder time contributing in elbow extension at the opposite joint, which is ultimately why people in the biomechanics camp believe the overhead tricep extension is more of a short head and medial head biasing exercise because you're kind of disadvantaging the long head. And since we're talking about the short head and medial head of the triceps, we cannot bias the short head from the medial head separately. However, what we can do is disadvantage the long head. Biomechanics believe if you have your arm overhead, that's a way to do it with an overhead tricep extension, or with some sort of triceps focusing pressing motion. So let's say like a dip or a close grip bench press. Those two exercises will disadvantage the long head and thus make it a more short head and medial head focused exercise. And as you can kind of tell, I'm more convinced on the side of what the biomechanics people believe, and that is long head equals shoulder at your side. So with that said, let's get into our first triceps exercise. All right, so the first exercise we're gonna be doing is a unilateral cross-body tricep extension. I'm gonna be doing this for 2 sets of, it's called 6 to 12. Now I mentioned earlier, this is gonna be a long head biasing tricep exercise. And I think it's good to focus on the long head first, predominantly because it's gonna be the biggest part of the triceps. Now I like doing this cross-body setup because it's gonna allow you to extend your arm in this more like natural elbow flare position, which comparatively you're using something like a rope, where it might be kind of limiting to extend with this natural elbow flare. You're kind of forced to extend downwards. I find it's a lot easier to cheat if you're like only pressing downwards, right? Compared to if you have this like natural elbow flare, which generally is gonna be easier not to cheat, especially as you approach failure. Also, of course, this is gonna be a unilateral exercise, and the reason why I prefer performing a unilateral tricep exercise. In general, unilateral exercises are gonna be better for hypertrophy if you're gonna be in a more stable position. And because in this case, I have my offhand to make sure I'm stable, and because the weight's gonna be half that amount compared to if I were to do this bilaterally, where inherently it's gonna be harder to stabilize with double the amount of weight compared to half that weight when you're performing it unilaterally. On top of that, because I feel like many of us struggle with that right to left muscle imbalance, performing a unilateral exercise and starting with the weaker arm, which in this case would be my right arm, allows us to, over time, attempt to minimize that muscular imbalance that can happen. Now change the angle of the camera over here because I want to show you exactly how you should be setting up this exercise. Now, the incorrect way to do it would be being next to the cable and extending with this internally rotated shoulder position. Some of y'all are gonna find that not too good feeling in your shoulder. So what I actually end up doing is being behind the cable. Now, when we're behind the cable, you don't want to have your shoulder drift up. You want to keep the shoulder at your side. You see here, if I'm behind the cable, I'm able to extend in a more neutral shoulder position. Notice how my front delt is facing forward. It's not facing inward over here like before. And then the last way to check my form on this exercise is ideally I want a mirror to be right in front of me. Pretend the camera's a mirror in this case. I want to make sure when I'm extending, I have the cable going through in my arm, right? It's aligned to my arm. I'm not like raising like this or like this, right? No, I want to make sure the cable is going through my arm like this. And And that is how you're gonna be performing a unilateral cross-body tricep extension. Moving on to the second exercise, which is actually gonna be a superset to this, meaning I want you to be bouncing around between this exercise and the second exercise. All right, the second exercise in this workout is gonna be a unilateral dumbbell preacher curl, but you can technically substitute with some sort of like unilateral face-away cable curl as well. Ideally, if you want to make things more efficient, I would superset this exercise with the first exercise where you're doing the cross-body tricep extension. Now, I personally prefer doing a unilateral preacher curl over a face-away cable curl because inherently it is going to be more stable with this rest. And as you probably noticed from other videos, stability is probably the key to choosing an exercise that's gonna be easy for you to progressive overload and allow you to really work towards building muscle in a more optimized way. But from a resistance profile perspective, both exercises are gonna be a more length and focus exercise, meaning the hardest part's gonna be in this lower part of the range of motion. And this is gonna be important because the biceps isn't the only muscle that contributes to elbow flexion, which is the act of bending your elbow. There's also gonna be the brachialis as well as the brachioradialis. And it so happens that the biceps will have the best leverage to do the active elbow flexion in this lower half part of the range of motion. Call it like from elbow extended to around like, let's call it midway through the exercise, which is roughly around here. Length and focus means the hardest part is gonna be in this more bottom stretch position. In this case, with this preacher curl, it's gonna be roughly around here, which of course lines with what I just mentioned where the biceps will have the best leverage in the bottom half. Now let's address the big elephant in the room, and that is a lot of people are scared that if you fully extend your elbow on a preacher curl, you're gonna somehow automatically tear your bicep. And while there's a reason for this, there are a lot of videos showing that people are like ripping their biceps fully extending on a preacher curl. You also notice that usually their form isn't that good, or they're just flat out ego lifting. So my advice here is, first off, perform it unilaterally because you're gonna have more control to like bail or avoid accidents from happening because you have your whole other arm to work with. Also, I recommend potentially working in like a higher rep range, so getting closer to around the upper end of that range I gave you, which of course means you're gonna be using lighter weights, and basically it's probably gonna feel a lot less risque and cringy to fully extend your elbow because admittedly in the beginning, it was kind of like a weird feeling performing this exercise full range of motion. And you know me, I'm pretty risk averse overall, so if I'm gonna do this exercise, there better be a good reason for doing it, and that is really because I cannot think of one single better biceps exercise. We're talking about stability, ease to progressive overload, resistance profile, and the fact that we're able to train unilaterally. Man, these explanations are getting pretty long, and I'm trying to be as thorough as possible because I know every time I say something, there might be questions that you might personally have, so I'm trying to cover as much as possible. With that said, if you're looking for more personal guidance on getting to your fitness goals, and pretty much take the guesswork out of getting to those fitness goals, I highly recommend you to apply to my exclusive one-on-one fitness coaching program where I literally do just that. Check out these previous body transformations, but customized workout program, nutrition advice, the ability to ask pretty much any questions you might have, as well as weekly check-ins. They're all included in this. So definitely look forward to seeing you in there. Apply in the link in the description. All right, so the third exercise we're gonna be doing goes back to the triceps. We're gonna be doing a unilateral overhead cable tricep extension. Now you can technically substitute this with dumbbell skull crusher, or even some sort of like triceps focused pressing exercise like a machine dip or a close grip bench press. But I personally prefer an overhead tricep extension or a dumbbell skull crusher because ultimately I find that if you're gonna train your triceps, I think isolation exercises are easier to perform, especially if you tend to be more chest dominant. Because then even on a close grip bench press, I think I find myself, as I approach failure, going back into old ways and just involving more of my chest. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this is gonna be a more short to medial head focused tricep exercise. Instead of using a rope and trying to do it the conventional way where you're kind of limited to the amount of elbow flare you can get, I prefer to opt to do this unilaterally for the same reasons why I like to do the crossbody version unilaterally as well. Now, I've tried many ways to set this up. I've tried being forward like here. I've tried facing away from the cable and kind of like going like over here and kind of just extending like this, but the main advantage of training unilaterally is making the exercise more stable, so ideally it's good to have some sort of like thing to hold on with your offhand. So the key way I like to set it up is actually facing more sideways. So I'm gonna sweep my arm above like here, take a step forward. With my offhand, I'm gonna brace on the other side. And I find this is probably the most intuitive way to do a unilateral cable tricep extension without having like issues with like it feeling weird in your shoulder or anything else. So definitely try this setup. All right, now the fourth exercise we're gonna be doing is a supinating incline dumbbell curl. Now you might be wondering, what is the point of doing this exercise if we already did a preacher curl, which is more length and focus, which is probably better for building the biceps than this exercise? Well, the key thing is the first word I use, and that is supinating. You see, a function of the biceps, other than the act of elbow flexion, is also supination, essentially turning the wrist so that your palms are facing up. And you can actually see when I supinate, the biceps actually moves. So essentially by supinating on a dumbbell curl, we're able to actually train that function, which we weren't able to do on a preacher curl, because I don't know about you, but if you're gonna wanna try to supinate on a preacher curl, it's probably gonna feel kind of weird. And you might be thinking, well, we can also supinate just by doing a regular standing or a seated upright dumbbell curl. In that case, what is the point of using incline bench? Well, personally, I find that the incline dumbbell curl is an overall more stable exercise than a standing or seated upright dumbbell curl. And yes, we're using that word again, stability. This is a common theme of the exercises in this video. You see, with an incline dumbbell curl, you want to keep your shoulders pinned back here, and you want to avoid having your shoulders come forward. And an easy tactile way to know that's not happening is you want to make sure that the back of your arm is in contact with the bench at all times. And as you go through this set, you're gonna know if your arms kind of slowly come off contact with it. So it's an easy way to check your form. On top of that, technically we're getting our arms behind the body, meaning we're actually putting our biceps at more of a stretch than before at the shoulder joint. And of course, instead of starting from a supinated arm position, the luxury of using dumbbells is that we can actually be dynamic and supinate as we go, meaning we change our wrist position as we perform this exercise. And thus train the biceps with that secondary function of supination. All right, people, now before we get on to the last exercise of the day, let's talk about hammer curls. Should you still be doing them? Are they vaulted? To give you guys some context with this, essentially a new study came out measuring internal moment arm lengths of all three elbow flexors. So, like I mentioned, there are three muscles that contribute to the act of bending your elbow. There's the biceps, there's the brachialis, which sits underneath the biceps, and then there's the brachioradialis, which is this upper forearm muscle. Now, this falls into the more of the biomechanics side, but the idea behind internal moment arm lengths is that the longer the internal moment arm of a muscle on that joint, the better biased that muscle is when contracting on that joint. So essentially, longer internal moment arm equals that is the muscle that is likely being biased there. And this study measured the internal moment arm on all three elbow flexors when doing a hammer curl, and they found that on a hammer curl, the brachialis had the shortest internal moment arm, meaning the brachialis is probably not being biased when you're doing a hammer curl, which is a big hit to a lot of people because it's been long said that a hammer curl is for the brachialis. So yikes there. All right, so with that said, back to the question. Should you still do hammer curls? Well, ultimately it depends on what your goal is with training the hammer curl. Now, if your goal is to train the brachialis, like I just mentioned, probably not a good idea to be doing the hammer curl for that. But I know a lot of you guys talk about wanting to grow your overall forearms, right? Everyone says, I want bigger forearms, I want my arms to look huge. And like I mentioned, a big area opportunity for a bigger forearm is the brachioradialis, which is one of the elbow flexors. And to finish the findings of that study, while the brachialis had the shortest internal moment arm and thus the least biased exercise, technically speaking from that finding, guess where the biceps placed? Second place, meaning the brachioradialis had the longest internal moment arm. Thus, think of the hammer curl as a brachialis exercise. If your goal is to train the brachialis and you want an overall bigger forearm, then there is your reason for doing a hammer curl. Now, I know you might be wondering, well, what about the reverse curl in that case? Meaning a curl done with a pronated grip. Well, if you've ever tried this exercise, you might know that the biggest limiting factor is going to be your grip. You're not going to have a good grip when you're doing this exercise because of that pronated grip. Thus, there's a limiting factor that is limiting your ability to actually train as hard as you probably can be on the brachioradialis. Now, on the other hand, no pun intended, if you're doing a hammer curl and keeping a neutral grip, well, your grip is going to be much less of a limiting factor compared to if you're using the reverse grip. Thus, you're actually going to be able to train at least closer to failure without having your grip be as much of a limiting factor if you're doing a hammer curl, which in my opinion is a strong case to be doing that exercise over a reverse curl. Which brings me to the last exercise. That's going to be a facing cross-body cable hammer curl. Now, I like doing a cross-body because you're keeping the center of mass closer to your body. And I like using the cables over the dumbbells because if you're using dumbbells, you're gonna have to do it alternating or else the dumbbells are gonna cluck together, especially if you're watching my videos, meaning you're gonna be super strong and you're gonna be using huge dumbbells that are gonna get in the way of each other. Now, you might be wondering, why am I facing the cables? Why don't I do it facing away like I would on a Bayesian curl that Jeff Nipper does, right? Well, for the same reason why you would normally want to face away doing a cable bicep curl, you actually want to be facing the cables if you're trying to bias the other elbow flexors minus that bicep. And it comes down to resistance profile. Like I mentioned before, the biceps are gonna have the best leverage to do elbow flexion in the bottom half of the range of motion. But if we're trying to bias the brachioradialis, or theoretically the brachialis as well, you're gonna wanna do the opposite of that. You're gonna want an exercise that focuses more on this upper part of the range of motion where the biceps will have less leverage, and thus by proxy, the brachioradialis should have more leverage. And the idea is on a face away cable bicep curl, this is gonna be a more lengthened focus exercise where the hardest part is gonna be in this more bottom half of the range of motion. However, if you flip that over and you face the cables, the hardest part is gonna be more around halfway to the more shortened part in the range of motion, which is exactly what we want. And thus, I'm gonna be facing the cables and staring to the abyss. All right, so now let's get on some final notes with this workout. First off, the forearms, as you saw, was the least prioritized muscle group of the 3 muscle groups trained in this workout. The reason being is the brachioradialis are kind of active in pretty much any curl you do. So in my opinion, it shouldn't be a priority for you unless it is absolutely your goal to like blow up your forearms. I believe in general, your time is probably better served trying to train more of the triceps and biceps rather than the forearms. Second thing is I highly recommend you incorporate these exercises throughout your own workout routine. I know not everyone's gonna be doing a pro split. Like I mentioned, might not be the best and most optimized workout routine. So don't just take this as a workout, take this as exercises that you should be including in your overall routine across the entire week. With that said, this was a pretty tough day of filming. I actually almost got like beat up. I pissed off like this really big guy earlier just by asking him, hey, can I work in? Because he saw I had a camera. Dare I say I almost had like a Jeff Nippard, Mike Van Dyke situation. Just know that I potentially risked my life making this video, so it would be much appreciated if you guys leave a like on this video. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to see more videos to level up your physique. And don't forget to hit the bell notification to get these videos right to you as they come out. More weekly uploads to come while I'm out here in Thailand. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you guys so much for watching this video. Good luck on your gains. Peace.